recording. Welcome to another Scientolopedia podcast. This is going to be the start of a 3-show set we're going to do on the subject of remote viewing. You probably heard about it, maybe you read about it, maybe you've heard some other radio shows or whatnot. Maybe you heard that Scientologists were involved in it way back in the day. Well, we're going to go into it a little more in depth and define it and talk about it and hash it around. And I know there's going to be some things that you did not know about it. There's things that we have a special guest I'm going to introduce just in a second. But the whole subject of remote viewing is fascinating. It's one that Scientologists and non-Scientologists have been fascinated with for many years. A lot of the information, it was kept secret for years, and then it's come out gradually. But anyway, we're going to dig into it and study it, look at it from a Scientology perspective. And this first show is going to be, we're going to go into the background and history of remote viewing and some of the key players and influential events that affected it. So let me introduce our first guest, or my guest, as I struggle to bring up the next video thing we have. Pardon the clumsy technician. If you're listening to this and you're not watching it, we're going to start showing some slides, and so we have some graphics to go along with what we're going to be talking about. Anyway, my guest is a man named Robin Adair. Robin is a Scientologist. He's actually an original OT7. He's also a Class 6 auditor. He did the St. Hill Special Briefing course, and he audits professionally today. Robin worked at the American St. Hill organization, doing what's called folder error summaries back, he can clarify this, but I'm going to say in the 80s. And then also worked at the Advanced Organization of Los Angeles as a case cracking auditor. These are the best of the best, and was tutored, mentored under Class 12 supervision there. So he brings a particular expertise on this whole area of the history of remote viewing and various aspects of it, government action in the area, and so forth. So I'm going to welcome Robin to the show. Welcome, Robin.
Wow, thanks for the applause. I like the special guest that came in on the special bus.
I almost said special guest as in plural, but then I realized, oh, wait a minute, we only have just one. But yeah, the applause was deafening. I don't know if you could hear it there on your end, but anyway,
yeah. I had to turn down my mic slightly. Anyways,
now did I get the biography correct? Did I miss anything?
Oh yeah, pretty much.
I hit the highlight.
Yeah. Okay. You hit the high points there. Yeah. Okay. CS was Class 12 Sandy Wilhair.
Okay.
AOLA, late 80s. Yeah. Fun times.
Well, the Wilhairs, there's a couple of Wilhairs. Was it her husband that was also a top executive in the church, or still is, or something?
I believe so. He was RTC Inspector General, I believe, for administration for a number of years.
Yeah, it's just one of those names that, you hear over the years. I didn't know him or work with him or whatever, but one of those famous names in Scientology, and we don't have them on Scientolopedia. We should, but maybe we'll get to it.
Oh, yeah.
So let me toss out the first question at you. The subject of remote viewing. Let me just ask you, first of all, what motivated your research into the subject? What got you interested in remote viewing?
Well, everybody back in the 70s heard about the project that was going on at SRI, the Stanford Research Institute, you know, on psychic phenomena, and it was the Guardian's office PR talked it up quite a bit, you know. Didn't mention all the details. Right. When Ingo Swann was quite predominant in the church, known as an artist and a writer and all that kind of stuff. And Al Pudoff and your personal friend, Pat Price.
Yeah, I forgot that part of the introduction because I'm going to add a little bit to this. I don't consider myself an expert, although I do have some expert knowledge of the events and people there, but I'm not by no means an expert. But I knew Pat Price, and he's going to come up a little bit later in our discussion. I knew him very well, and so I have some experiences of actually being at Stanford Research Institute, which you mentioned, and some insights from, he was sort of you might say, one of the two superstars in that whole program. So we'll cover him in a bit. But yeah, back at that time in the 70s, it was, of course, it was a different time with the whole Scientology, the church. You know, there's a lot more of a, I'm just going to use the term spiritual sort of environment, as opposed to how the church became just this total dedication to money, 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 buildings, buildings, buildings type of thing, you know. But back then people believed in the future and the potentials of this human spirit, and that anything was possible. And of course, you know, that's something that some of us still think is the way it could be and should be. But yeah, it was a fascinating time back then. So, well, I want to just define remote viewing first of all. I've got a slide here, which is comes from the CIA's own Stargate write-up of it years later after the fact. But these are two definitions, or a couple of definitions here about what it is, and then we're also going to define it from a Scientological perspective. But the remote viewing is defined as the acquisition and description by mental means of information blocked from ordinary perception by either distance, shield, or time. So that's a good working on the ground sort of Homo sapien, you could say, definition of remote viewing. And a remote viewer, they define as a person who perceives, communicates with, and or perturbs, which I find is an interesting word to choice there. Perturbing something is like if you put your hand in a lake that's completely still and the ripples effect, you perturbed it. So a remote viewer is a person who perceives, communicates with, or perturbs characteristics of a designated target, person, or event. Anyway, I just found that an interesting choice of words to use there in that definition. Do you have any comment about how Stargate defined it there, Robin?
No, that's pretty much how they defined it. As far as perturbing, they were working toward what was known as psychokinesis, you know, adjusting, you know, mentally, mind over matter. But I don't think, well, as far as I know, studying all the documents related to Stargate, I don't think they ever took. Well, there was one experiment conducted at the Varian Hall of Science in Stanford University that sort of came up to that level. You know, where Joe Swan is known to have perturbed a magnometer that was measuring quarks. So, caused an influence on the actual measurements. So yeah, there might have been a bit of that, but for the most part, it was mainly acquiring intelligence over a distance. You know, using what Scientologists call theta ability, and what the CIA called some kind of mental trick of some kind. So,
right. Yeah, they further define it when they say the accessing of information without the use of the normal five senses, or information from other people, or from logical deductions, or any direct connection or implementation or electronic device. And
exactly.
They go on to say that it's a talent, and this I find interesting. They did recognize that it's a talent which is inherent to every human to some degree. But then they say it's probably some vestigial form of self-preservation, which, as a Scientologist, again, we know it's not. It's OT abilities, but they do point out that it's largely ignored in today's society, which is true. We're pretty much a materialistic society today, so any of these kind of ESP or extra sensory or extra curricular activities are kind of ignored or poo-pooed. And but they note that through proper training, they can be developed. A person's individual potential can be developed on this. So there comes the Scientology connection right there. I wonder who demonstrated that there's possible development can be effectuated on people.
Well, according to Ingo Swann, he says that, initially when they started researching the remote viewing, they used what were called outbounders. These are people who were sort of acted like beacons for the remote viewer, actually perceiving through their eyes what was going on. It's discussed quite a bit in Targ and Pudov's book Mind Reach. They went to various locations around San Francisco, and they would have somebody go to a certain location, and then the remote viewer back at SRI would determine what they were looking at.
Mm-hmm.
That was initial experimentation in the remote viewing. And supposedly,
and what do they call it again?
Outbounding.
Outbounding. Okay, that's a good one.
They were called outbounders. Strange term, but that's what they used.
Yeah. Well, and that blends right in with I wanted to mention the sort of from a Scientological perspective, we have a couple of different. You could call them stable datums. Like we have axiom 1, where life is defined as basically a static. And of course, the definition of a static is it has no mass, no motion, no wavelength. But what's particularly interesting in this definition is no location in space or in time. It has the ability to postulate and perceive, of course, but no location in space or in time. So a life static, from a remote viewing perspective, wouldn't have any position in space or in time. So that outbounder, they would be able to be right there with them. They wouldn't be remotely looking at them. There would be no barriers to space or time. And then you had pointed out a definition in the Tech Dictionary on remote viewpoint, which adds a little bit of an extra look at this, which is a viewpoint without the consideration by the thetan that he is located at that point. The thetan may have any number of remote viewpoints. So a thetan could consider, he could be looking at, the car in the driveway while he's sitting in his living room, if he considered that so. And that gets into also exteriorization, which is a common concept amongst Scientologists. Anybody that's done TR's RTRs or objectives or gotten somebody somewhere along the line has had some experience with exteriorization to some degree, whether it's with full perception or just some limited perception. And even people outside of Scientologists, they've had out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, watching themselves in operating rooms. These stories are rampant all over the internet, all over society and books, and they've been handed down forever, for years. So Scientology has this concept of a thetan. It's a state of a thetan, the individual himself being outside of his body. So again, if we're tying this into remote viewing, if somebody's outside their body, they themselves are looking at whatever they're looking at. They're not remotely doing it, So it's just kind of a distinction that I think is good to make.
Yeah.
So
also, when you're talking, may I interrupt for a second? But also, when you're talking about outbounding, there, if you look in Creation of Human Ability, which came out in the early 50s, on group processing techniques, he also has a group processing session where he actually has a person staring out the window and people in the group describing what the person saw or was looking at the time. I mean, here we're just discussing a matter of viewpoints and also what you'd consider remote viewpoint, right? Looking through somebody else's eyes or something like that, right?
Yeah. Well, back in those early days, LRH came up with a lot of processes. That book, Creation of Human Ability, had that's where the grand tour is in that book, which is, sending a guy to the various, the sun, the moon, and go around the planets, so they were.
And Mars. Yeah.
Yeah. And other processes to exteriorize a person. So, and that ties into, we're going to talk more about this parallel developments going on between Dianetics and Scientology, and then what the government was involved in. And that's what we're going to dig into here shortly. But I just thought I'd bring up this history a bit. In the sense of, it goes way back. I've got a slide up now, which is showing the Oracle of Delphi. So we can go way back in history, and we could pick many, many other examples. But the Oracle was someone who could foresee the future, and people would go to this person and try to discern, get an advantage, get one up on their opponent. In fact, you told a funny story about a king asking the oracle. What was that about, asking the oracle something?
Yeah, who'd win the battle? And the oracle replied that a king would win the battle. He thought it was him, but it turned out to be the other king. So it didn't ask the precise question, I guess.
Not a perfect science, but the point of the matter is, people, leaders in particular, were interested in, staving off, either possible enemies or palace intrigue or whatnot. And they would go to the seers, the shamans, there was a recognition that there's some extra knowledge that could be ascertained rather than through direct eyeball observation. And so down through history, governments, states have tried to utilize or tap into that information, and we can come up to, more other examples. We've had in the like even moving up into the 20th century, Raiders of the Lost Ark had that theme of Hitler's agents out scouring for, archives to get some extra power from, some relic. But, you had people in various positions. I know that Eleanor Roosevelt, I think, believed in seances and astrology and whatnot on up through Nancy Reagan. I even heard that Hillary Clinton consulted astrologers. So people in positions of power have been trying to get, an inside track on some extra, an extra channel of information for a long time is basically the bottom line.
Oh, yeah, it's quite common. A lot of people think the elite are so pragmatic and materialistic, but a lot of them are involved in the occult to a greater or lesser degree. Channeling information, using crystals, all kinds of new age wild stuff that you never hear about.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting because occult means hidden, and that's a basic definition. And when you discuss occult with the intelligence community, as it's called, actually espionage and spying, a lot of what they do is hidden. So you can see there's a sort of a parallel there between, the intelligence community, spies and such, and secret societies, because they use a lot of coded messages and secret hand signals and that, going back to the Knights Templar and the Jesuits and people like that. So
even more recently, we got Skull and Bones.
Oh yeah, the Skull and Bones. Those guys, just a fun bunch. But yeah. I mean,
well, I was going to segue on that from the next slide I have is a gentleman named Wilhelm Wundt. And the reason I've got him up there is he was the mid-19th century. I guess he was a doctor. I don't know whether he was a physician or what, but he's considered the father of psychology. And right there in the middle of the 19th century is when you can sort of see a shift from looking at these extra sources of knowledge, extra century or whatnot, coming from spiritual or spiritual sources to Wundt and his following, of psychologists and psychiatrists declared that, there was no such thing as a spirit, that it was all brain, all mind. And that's where the materialism really started to get, sunk into its hooks in. And that's when the states started utilizing these guys as the ones to research the mind, so to speak.
Exactly. Well, yeah, Ron discusses Wundt quite a number of times. He was, the father of what was considered modern psychology that didn't acknowledge that there was a spirit. And psychology basically means study of the spirit, psyche, spirit, study of. And so, he took the whole subject off the rails, because before that, people considered psychology as, part of the spirit and the mind and all that kind of stuff. And one said there was no such thing as a spirit. He was, a lot of his, shall we say, quote, scientific, unquote, method was based on Hegel and Marx and all these fun guys that were into what was called dialectic materialism. Two great forces colliding with one another to create history, and it was all based on material,
Right.
Total materialism. Right. Right, exactly.
Messed.
Right.
Well, so we have at the by the middle of the 20th century, of course, there's World War II, and that's a key point in sort of this whole story, because out of World War II came the U.S. intelligence agency known as, well, it was OSS and then CIA, but they also started with Operation Paperclip, the U.S. intelligence agency and the Soviets too were going after the, you could say, the Nazi, brain trust. The Nazi, like the most famous one in that operation was Werner von Braun, who was the rocket scientist the Nazis had that was brought over to the U.S. to develop the U.S. space program. But that point in history started where the state sponsoring of investigation into means, chemical or otherwise, of tapping into the mind and using the mind to gather more information or to suppress individuals. That's where it really started. In fact, I want to talk about, I've got a slide up of this Sidney Gottlieb character, but it kind of goes along with, at the same time we had the, like I said, the OSS and the CIA, the NSA, the DIA. So I'd like you to give us maybe just a little overview. We're going to toss out some terms here, like maybe people have heard of MKULTRA. That's the most famous one, but there's other programs that these guys started back then, coming out of World War II in the early 50s, to experiment on people and drug them, test them, to try to get brainwashed, see if brainwashing was possible, all these kind of things. So what's your take on that whole era?
Well, we go back to the OSS, of course, and this is from John Mark's book, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate. Now, the Germans were testing a drug called mescaline, and for interrogation purposes. Now, we take off here the Office of Strategic Services, America's wartime intelligence agency, set up a Truth Drug Committee under Dr. Winfred Oberholzer, head of St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, which is a very notorious psychiatric hospital, where government employees, with high security clearance are sent to if they lose their minds. Sort of like Frank Olson, for example.
I was going to ask about him, talk about him.
Oh, we'll get to him. The committee quickly tried and rejected mescaline, several barbiturates, and scopolamine, which is a hypnotic drug. Then, during the spring of 1943, the committee decided that cannabis indica, which is, basically marijuana or a derivative thereof, showed the most promise and started a testing program in cooperation with the Manhattan Project, the top secret effort to build an atomic bomb. It's not clear why OSS turned to the bomb makers for help, except that, as one former official puts it, our secret was so great, I guess we were safer than anyone else. So apparently, top leaders who went to incredible lengths to preserve security saw no danger in trying out drugs on their personnel. So we're talking about the guys who made the atomic bombs. A lot of them are potheads, stoners.
That's comforting.
Yes, that's comforting to know. Wow, look at that, man. Anyway.
Let's see if it'll go boom.
Gives you a whole, gives you a whole new perspective on what happened in New Mexico at the Trinity site.
Well, let me just interject this viewpoint where it seemed to be okay to test these substances and play around with things unknown on human subjects is a thread that runs through for decades and probably to this day. But back then, like you mentioned, pot, I think you're going to bring up the LSD and the and these guys. but they just had no qualms about testing their, seeing what reactions they could get from different substances, whether it's a hallucinogenic or a pot, for example, or, I mean, I don't know if you get a chance to look at that document I sent you where about the history of experimentation on American citizens, but there is a long, ugly history of, injecting inmates with syphilis to see if they could then cure it, and cancer, and spraying cities with different things. And there's just this government out of control picture that you get starting around that period. But as far as the mind stuff, how did it sort of evolve from OSS, CIA, and then these projects, these official projects like Bluebird, Artichoke, MKUltra? How did those kind of evolve out of all this?
Okay, well, the Truth Drug Committee we could say disbanded when OSS was discontinued, and then the CIA was created in 1947 with the National Security Act, which created the Air Force and created the National Security Council. And our friends on the dark side, the Central Intelligence Agency, which is actually supposed to be an intelligence agency, but they managed to insert a nice little loophole in the original legislation that allowed a whole series of semis to drive through, and all 8 lanes of the 405 could have driven through it too, because it allowed the CIA to basically do whatever it wanted without unvouchered funds. And one of their little pet projects was run under the Office of Security, which was basically internal security for the CIA. It was called Bluebird, which, experimented with different types of drugs for interrogation. And then there was an interagency, which included, the Office of Naval Intelligence, which is probably how Ron heard about it, and other members of the intelligence community at that time, like the Army's G2 and FBI, that included experimentation with other drugs called Artichoke. And then we get to what is MKUltra, which is around 1952-53, is a program that was headed by our friend Sidney Gottlieb, and he headed what was called the technical services staff. Technical services was the section of the CIA involved in making all kinds of gadgets and that for use by spies, and also they were involved in, let's say they were the mad scientists of Central Intelligence that created all these gadgets, but also worked on biochemical and chemical compounds of one kind or another. And their favorite was LSD. God knows why, but for interrogation purposes, LSD is pretty much useless, but they seem to like it. In fact, a lot of technical services staff tried it out for themselves. They were the first acid heads, pretty much.
Was Timothy Leary involved with that at this time, or did he come along later?
Leary came along later when much of their research into LSD and its effects moved on to various college campuses under the Psychology Fund. And they included, they spread it around to these various institutions and that. And they They managed to get a bunch of subjects who were interested in doing LSD.
That's an interesting point. I just like interject there that MKUltra involved hundreds of institutions throughout the country, and many or most of those institutions didn't know they were the experiments they were tasked to do. They would come from a third party, and they didn't necessarily know that they were working for the CIA. So it's pretty pervasive. In fact, Stanford Research Institute was one of those institutions, which of course comes up later on. But at this time, they were funding all kinds of research to, probe into what reactions they could get, mental or physical reactions they could get on people with varying drugs. And of course, how would that play out in the field for spying purposes or interrogation purposes or gathering intel or creating a Manchurian candidate type of operation.
Oh yeah, they had their fingers in all kinds of pies, like hypnosis and Ron described it in Science of Survival, under narcosynthesis. Where he called it pain drug hypnosis. They were using many, in 1951 actually. He sort of blew the whistle on this sort of operation that was being done under the auspices of the government,
Right.
And I'm sure he created a lot of friends in the intelligence community by doing so, because at that time the program was pretty much top secret, is at the highest levels you could possibly imagine.
Yeah, I want to talk about that more in a second, about how Dianetics came on the scene around this time and the different philosophy behind that. But just to sort of nail this down a little more firmly, we have a guy named Frank Olson who actually died, and people died as a result of this playing around with the mind, with drugs and so forth. And Frank Olson is a famous case because I think the CIA lost a suit to his son years later, and they had to pay up, and it came out in Senate hearings and so forth, congressional hearings, that he had been given LSD. And was it Gottlieb that had given him the LSD, or was it somebody else? Do you know off the top of your head?
I think it was Gottlieb, and it was in a drink. He had one of his drinks spiked at a secret meeting that they were having in upstate New York, and he ended up going insane. So they took him to St. Elizabeth. Right. They took him to a safe house in the Statler Hotel in New York City, and he jumped to his death, well, that's the story, but he didn't bother opening the window beforehand, which a lot of people thought was kind of strange, but, let's move along here, folks, nothing to see here. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. It's
like the people connected with Clinton that commit suicide with a couple of bullets to the back of their head type of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, or fired, supposedly shot themselves with an antiquated .38 caliber, and it turns out that what ends up in their head is a 9mm bullet. It's like, easy to explain, of course.
A lot of strange stuff, magic bullets that kill presidents and so forth. But we don't want to go too far afield, but I did want to drive home the point that the track that these guys are on led to death. I mean, they were killing people, and they would have no qualms, no ethical qualms at all about giving LSD to their coworkers or to an unsuspecting public or prisoners or hospital patients that didn't know they were being experimented on. So the trail of death and destruction that followed them is decades long and involved tens of thousands of people. I want to ask you, I got a slide up of this Dr. Christopher Kit Green. What's his role
Oh
in
yeah,
all of this?
Well, he had really nothing to do with MKUltra per se. He came along later in the life sciences division of the CIA, which was the one most interested in remote viewing. Some of us suspect that he was the Kenneth Kress that wrote the article for the Center for the Study of Intelligence called Parapsychology and Intelligence. And he was, you could say, the case officer for the remote viewing program. In
the 70s?
He was buddies with Hal and Ingo and Pat. And if you go into MindReach, you can see, pictures of them all together, So he's an interesting character. There's a bunch of interesting characters in the whole remote viewing pantheon, you could say. That would take a long time, to put together. The list of usual suspects would be quite long.
But he's a link to the CIA, and later if we fast forward to the early 70s when Scientologists are getting involved in remote viewing, he's a definite proven link between them and the CIA, we could say.
Yeah, there's some shade thrown on the whole story. Supposedly, Hal Podoff and Russell Targ went to the Office of Scientology, the Director of Science and Technology in the CIA, and convinced them to fund remote viewing. That's the story, right? They showed them all these films about, there was a book written called Psychic, Developments Behind the Iron Curtain. And supposedly this was the emphasis behind, the CIA's own program. But it's funny because Kress, when he's writing for a bunch of spooks in the Center for Studies in Intelligence, doesn't even mention this fact. The CIA had been interested in remote viewing or psychic phenomena since the early 50s, he says in that article. So it's, another story that sort of explains, like when they had Hunter, who is supposedly a newspaper writer for various newspapers and publications. He coined the term brainwashing, and this was supposed to explain why the intelligence community got involved in, the mind control projects that they did. But the fact is that according to, John Mark's research, it goes back to the OSS, even before this great, the Cold War started. So,
right. That old game's been going on and still going on today if you watch closely what's going on in the news. But blame the Soviets. The Soviets are doing it. The Soviets are, investigating psychic powers, psychic abilities. So we got to follow suit, and that justifies all the drug experimentation and people we're killing here.
Exactly. They have to create some kind of narrative, that the public will swallow. So, like that, Soviets are doing it, so we got to do it too,
It's Russia. They just dropped out the Soviets. It's like kind of funny when just Russia this, Russia that, Russia. But, these false flags from Vietnam to Iraq to, I mean, it's just, if you understand this subject and you want a little bit about current events, you can see where this game's been played over and over and over again. It's like an old record.
Oh, exactly. I mean, the Russians or the Soviets did spend quite a number of rubles on, what they called psychotronics, which was influencing people at a distance and psychokinetic abilities. But the thing is that at the same time, the U.S. had various institutions that were involved in psychic research, like the Rhine Institute and others, even the Ford Foundation, that were involved in research into parapsychology. So, the U.S. wasn't all of a sudden oh my God, the Russians are doing it. It was like, they'd already been doing it for years. So it's like,
yeah,
that excuse just doesn't work.
Yeah, and I'm talking about the justification for the crimes that they were committing, being that, well, we've got to do this because our enemy, our mortal enemy, the Soviet Union or the Russians or Saddam Hussein or whatever, fill in the blank, they're doing it, so we have to do it, and that's why we did it. Anyway, exactly. We know that as Scientologists, when you behind the withhold or the overt, there's a made up motivation.
Yeah, exactly.
You got to justify it somehow. You got to be motivated to do it somehow.
Oh yeah, and then there's the HCOB on the criminal mind, where the criminal accuses others of doing what they are doing, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, that's I think that covers that era. But right at the same time, we got these guys trying to do all this experimentation using drugs and hypnotism and even radiation, experimenting on humans and trying to see if they can be turned into Manchurian candidates and whatnot. And along comes L. Ron Hubbard, and he writes this manual that anybody could pick up and read and sit down across from someone else and undo it all. And totally undo their brainwashing efforts or whatever. And they had to be going, what is up with this Hubbard guy? But his track, that his research into the mind, and which eventually also became in research into the spirit, was not to trap or control or somehow overwhelm an individual, but was just the opposite. He was on a completely different vector, 180 degrees. He was trying to figure out how to free an individual, how to, rid somebody of their psychosomatic or their unwanted fears, phobias, losses, mental suffering, mental anguish, all of those kind of things. And in the process, if they happen to have been picked up by the CIA and subjected to some brainwashing, undo that too. What the heck? So, he had to have been on the radar right then.
Well, he had already made himself a friend to the AMA by releasing Dianetics, Modern Science of Mental Health, and saying that over 70% of man's ills are psychosomatic. And, for back then, maybe 50 cents, you could buy a book called Dianetics, Modern Science of Mental Health, or not even buy it. You could go to your local friendly library and pick up a copy and audit a friend and, eliminate some of these psychosomatic ills. And I'm sure he wasn't. And, the AMA at that time was up in arms. And then in 1951, he wrote Science of Survival, where he talks about the government's mind control projects and how Dianetics could undo this. So he, made another friend right there.
Big old target on his back, you could say.
Exactly. So.
Yeah. Well, I think if you're going to understand remote viewing and what happened there, you've got to understand these two vectors that came together at that point in history and how they were diverged, and how one or both, that collision had widespread ramifications. And so in 1950, 51, this is the first big bump, where they ran into each other. And then they come back at varying points after that. And in the early 70s was another point where the remote viewing experiments really caught the attention even more so. If they weren't already on the radar, they were really on the radar after those experiments at SRI. But anyway, I think that's just vital to understand what happened at SRI, Stanford Research Institute, and with the remote viewing experiments later on. Is this is a collision of philosophy, a collision of purpose, that exactly. Has played out ever since.
Well, in 1960, I believe it was 63, Ron wrote the HCOPL called Freedom from Politics, where he objected to governments using the technology to advance their military or warlike ends. So he wasn't really, let's say, up for the government using Scientology for, their warlike ends, basically. So,
right.
Sure, if he had known about it, he would have been quite perturbed by it. Talking about perturbation, So.
Yeah, definitely. Well, this was it's a key point. I just wanted to illustrate that. We don't need to beat it to death, but the next sort of little thing that I wanted to bring up, I've got the slide up where LRH has got the e-meter connected to the tomato plant, and of course this gets widely ridiculed. Certain atheistic bloggers on the Church of Scientology like to make fun of this one and others, to make him look ridiculous and crazy. But what he was really doing was something very interesting. It was he was exploring what are the characteristics of life and how does life react, whether it's plant life or animal life or human life. He was isolating what we call theta, the spirit in everything, all of life. And the proof of that was that later on, this guy, Cleve Baxter, who worked for the CIA, I've got his slide up, and he found out about it. Now, this is 1959 when the articles came out about LRH's, testing or experiments on plants. Then about a decade later, this Cleve Baxter picks up on the whole thing. And I think he wrote a book, and then that book was turned by someone else into the one that, what was it called? Secret Life of Plants, which became a famous book at the time. I even remember hearing about it as a kid. But that is just a little validation of how, again, this is a CIA guy bumping into L. Ron Hubbard's experiments and looking at it, and this is a little bit that sort of slipped out or creeped out into the mainstream even before it was known that the CIA was, doing research on psychic phenomena and so forth.
Yeah, well, let me mention that Baxter just changed the protocols from using an e-meter to using a lie detector for his experiments, which is kind of hard to imagine using, a polygraph, which has many different more hookups than an e-meter. But, it was basically Ron's research that he plagiarized, and, repackaged, basically.
Yeah, which is another theme that's recurred over and over and over and over and over again. We get so tired of people taking of snippets of LRH's research and then coming up with a whole new ism or ology or breakthrough life improvement activity when
Yeah,
they
I
sit
mean,
down.
we call that Boatwell, based on the works of
Boat.
Hubbard.
Oh, yeah, but they don't even do that. They don't even give any credit at all. They.
Yeah, I know.
And we're going to talk about that when we talk about Ingo Swann and Hal Puthoff, who have at one point, acknowledged themselves as Scientologists and OTs, and then later on, years later, they deny it all and give no credit whatsoever to L. Ron Hubbard. So it's a very annoying aspect to not only this story, but many other stories that, related to Hubbard and Scientology. And since I mentioned, we might as well sort of wind this down a little bit. I mentioned Hal Puthoff. There's a few key players that we're going to really dive into in the next show, but Puthoff is one. He was a Scientology OT7. And Ingo Swann is another, who I'm showing slides of these guys right now, who is a Class 6 auditor as well as an OT7. And then a third guy by the name of Pat Price, who was an OT3. But Puthoff and Swann were the first ones to make contact with the CIA and get sort of the blessing or the blessing to experiment and do the experiments at Stanford Research Institute. What would you like to add about, Puthoff and Swann and those early connections to the CIA and remote viewing experiments?
Well, these. Let me say that. For instance, they try to present the idea that Puthoff and Swann didn't know each other until they started working together on remote viewing, along with Pat Price. Yet they were familiar with each other long before this point, because they all went to the same organizations, the Advanced Organization of Los Angeles, and they hung around the Celebrity Center at the time. So
I was going to say, Yvonne knew them all.
Oh yeah, and they knew each other, and it was like when you read Ingo Swann's disinformation booklet called "Remote Viewing: The Quote Real Story," unquote. It's he's trying to present the idea that none of these people knew each other, before they got involved in the remote viewing project at SRI. But it's as flaky as anything else he writes, basically, about the whole thing. And he doesn't even accredit Scientology to his psychic abilities, which he contradicts in 2 interviews he had given to in Advance magazine on the subject, where he says, Scientology was consequential in his ability to remote view. So, there's a lot of obscuring of the information.
Any speculation on what would have flipped him later on, or just case, or did somebody get to him? They wanted to wipe the slate clean. L. Ron Hubbard having any connection to any of this? What's your take?
Well, I think they were doing like what most intelligence communities tend to do, and that is obscure the source of their information. Sources and methods is a very highly highly confidential aspect of the intelligence community. They do a lot to try and make sure that nobody knows their sources and methods unless they have a need to know. So, it was basically an effort to obscure that source, which was Scientology techniques and the methods used. I mean, it was Ingo actually in the early 70s discussed that in a article that he wrote. called Scientological Techniques, a Modern Paradigm for the Exploration of Consciousness and Psychic Integration. And it still says on my copy document that it was for government use only. Gee, I wonder why. But he released this paper at a international psychotronics conference in Prague in 1973. So, and he says in the beginning of the original text, he says, in 1953, a novel method of psychical rehabilitation through the use of recall and erasure of traumatic material was introduced by the publication of Dianetics, Modern Science of Mental Health by L. Hubbard. It enjoyed voluminous sales and acclaim. Hubbard subsequently developed other mental inspection processes which, because these differed in context from Dianetic recall, he termed as Scientology, or the science of knowing how to know. Since the introduction of Scientology, both the subject and the movement it has inspired among many people have been both topics of derision from detractors on one hand and the source of significant emergent ability improvement on the other hand among most who have availed themselves of Scientological techniques. That's in his first paragraph. I mean,
wow.
I mean, the article goes on to, oh yeah, you know, he says that it's not the, he says that is, yeah, I mean, there's 5 pages, but I believe
we'll have to make we'll have to make that available. Yeah, if you send it to me, I'll figure out either put it up on Scientolopedia or I'll list it in the links to after this show. But you know, just to wrap up on Ingo and Puthoff changing their story, it wouldn't surprise me seeing they knowing this history of the CIA not being too kind to some of its you know, own people. You know, they could have been the fear put into them. You know, Pat Price came to a surprising and untimely end in 1975. Who a lot of people speculate was not of natural causes, including myself, believe that. But anyway, we'll delve more into it in the next show as far as Swan and Puthoff and Price and some other players and people involved in the whole research that went on at Stanford Research Institute. So I think that's a good point. Did you have any other anything that you meant to bring up on this show that we didn't get to, or anything else you wanted to say before we sort of wrap it up here?
Well, all I'd like to say is this paper proves pretty much conclusively that much of remote viewing, in fact, all of it was based on Scientology techniques. I mean, it says so right there in that article. So, you know, what they did in later years is just obfuscate the issue, but you can find, and eventually the, you know, the original OT levels mysteriously vanished off the grade chart after a few years after this. Strangely, you know, no longer delivered at the church anymore. So, but most of the techniques after OT3 were directed toward improving one's capabilities as an operating state and to operate exterior. So, and then all of a sudden those went missing from the grade chart for some strange reason. Who knows? But very interesting, yeah. You know.
Well, it definitely takes some
things happen.
Yeah, it takes some strange twists and turns, and you know, the ramifications of what came out of those experiments, I think, were still impacting the church and Scientologists today. So I'm anxious to get at the next installment of this, but thank you very much for joining me today, Robin, and I appreciate your wisdom, your knowledge, your insight, etc. But we'll.
You're welcome, brother.
All right. So thanks again, and I will see you soon. I'm going to wind this down. Let me just see if I have another. I should have put this up earlier. I'm just going to let it sit for a second. There's some links that people watching this video can see. I'll also put those where, on YouTube and whatnot, they'll be posted along with the recording. Of course, people that hear just the audio portion of this, they'll have to go to probably Scientolopedia or to YouTube to get these links. Anyway, thanks again, Robin. It was great talking to you. It's a fascinating subject. Never get tired of talking about it and exploring it. I'm going to wind this down with a little bit of music, and we will see you soon. Take care.
Okay. You too.
All right. And thank you all for tuning in and watching this podcast, part 1 of remote viewing. And we'll be coming out with the next installment. Follow us on Facebook. Go to our YouTube channel and subscribe there. And we'll see you here soon. Bye-bye.